Hello, everybody. Hello, John was mentioning the power of Puffins. The power of Puffins to fill the Wheeler Theater on the first sunny day we've had for a while. So Puffins are incredibly powerful. Welcome, everybody, to a lecture in our series. My name is Jen Kingfisher. I am the brand new Deputy Director and Director of Development at the Port Townsend Marine Science Center. Yay! I'm really excited to be here and be a part of the Marine Science Center once again. I've been a part of the Marine Science Center a couple times, once in 1997 as a college intern. We'll tell stories about that later. But please come and introduce yourself or reintroduce yourself to me. Come see me at Flagship Landing. Love to create a relationship with all of you. And why do I keep coming back to the Marine Science Center? It's this right here, right? All these people excited and engaged. It's the intersection of science, education, and community. People with curiosity coming together. That's something to get passionate about for sure, right? Yeah. Okay. So all of you are what makes this possible, this Future of Ocean series. It's intentionally free. I know a lot of you were donating as you came in. Thank you so much for those donations that make that possible, and other experiences for other audiences possible. So please donate if you haven't already. And big shout outs to the Darrow family. We need Darrow family for... Making this sort of series available to our community is essential, and thank you for those of you who make that happen. So I do want to share a couple of other things that are happening at the Marine Science Center. Next month, February 15th, the Future of Ocean series includes a talk by Chris Kelly on sponges. So we'll see. Sponges in a sunny day, what will happen? So I also want to call your attention to a couple of other exciting happenings. Summer camp registration is open, so sign up your young people for summer camps. Tomorrow is MLK Day of Service. If you want to work on that, you can do also myriad things around, but you could join folks at the Marine Science Center at 10 at the exhibit for beach grass pulling. And I really want to invite you to our upcoming Tides of March benefit, and that takes place in the Commons on March 21st, so please put that in your calendar. It'll be a fun event supporting this wonderful organization that's offering this space for us to be curious, lifelong learners about the marine sciences and other sciences. So mark your calendar, please. I'm going to now go on to tonight's program. I will ask you to think about what your phone's going to do if somebody texts you. Just take a moment, think about it, or calls you. Okay, so clearly Puffins make us smile. Yeah, they're cute, they've got fun hairdos, and they've caught our imagination. And not only are they cute and charming and charismatic, they are something more important. They're sentinels of ocean health, offering critical insight into the changing marine ecosystems. Tonight's lecture is titled Puffins, Beloved Sentinels of Ocean Health, and it will be presented today by Dr. John Piatt. John's lifelong fascination with seabirds began in Newfoundland, where he spent his early years working at seabird colonies and surveying birds and whales at sea. That passion led to a 37-year career as a research scientist with the U.S. Department of Interior, studying seabirds across Alaska's coast and the northern Bering Sea. Over the course of his career, John explored dozens of seabird colonies and contributed to more than 350 scientific papers and reports, served as a journal editor and advisor, and worked with scientists around the world to deepen our understanding of marine ecosystems. He's retired as of 2024 and is one of the founders of the World Puffin Congress. What is the World Puffin Congress? We're going to find out. Tonight, John's going to take us beyond puffins we know as the cereal mascot, you know, or a plushie toy or a postage stamp, and reveal extraordinary lives of puffins as powerful marine predators to help us understand both their resilience and their greatest vulnerabilities in a changing ocean. So please join me in welcoming Dr. John Piatt.
Well, thanks very much. I guess I'll leave this hat on because it helps me see with that light shining there. But first we do a little poll. I want to see how many people have actually seen a puffin. Oh my goodness. Okay, well that's good. All right. We'll do a little test. How many people have actually held a puffin? Yeah, okay. And how about held a puffling? Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. You wish. Yeah. Well, good. I'm glad you're here, and I want to talk a little bit about some, puffin biology and what makes puffins so cool and hardy, and move on a little bit to talk about what kinds of things they're telling us about what's happening in the ocean today. So this is a common sort of understanding of puffins because a lot of people have never seen them in the wild, and all they ever see them is in gift stores, and they look plush and they look cute, and they are, except for that big one, which is looks pretty intimidating. But they're also, master mariners. They're incredible athletes, and they are voracious predators. Kind of scary, really. So, there's the myth, and then there's the reality. There are 4 puffins. We just settled that right now. You may have seen with the Atlantic puffin, which lives only in the Atlantic, and then the 3 puffins that live in the Pacific. And you have presumably at least seen either the tufted or the horned puffins if you saw them in the Pacific. And if you've seen a rhinoceros auklet, which is the name that is currently called, then you've seen a puffin as well, because it's actually a puffin. It's not an auklet. That was a mistake. That was a overzealous naturalist description. It was actually originally called a horn-billed puffin. That was the first name it was given because they recognized it as a puffin, but somewhere along the line somebody said it looks more like an auklet, which are much smaller animals and feed on plankton. The rhinoceros puffin is a puffin. It looks like a puffin. It smells like a puffin. It tastes like a puffin, and it's got all the habits of a puffin, and it lives in burrows, and it feeds its chick lots of fish, and blah blah blah. It's a puffin, and it lives on the biggest colony on the west coast is Protection Island, which is just around the corner. So that is the largest puffin colony on the west coast of the United States, and it's 5 miles from here. And you can see lots of rhinos here almost any time of year, but certainly, especially in the spring, you can see them right here in Port Townsend Bay. Just take the ferry, and you'll see thousands of them. Anyway, it's a puffin. I may call it that from now on. The 4 puffins are members of the auk family, as some of you probably know, named for the auk, the great auk, the biggest bird there, which is now extinct. It was flightless, and it was harvested too heavily years ago, and when it was exterminated. But now there's 24 species of auks left, thank goodness. And the puffins are sort of the mid-sized to largish-sized, mostly fish feeders. And a lot of those little ones in the middle are the merlets and the auklets. They are smaller, and the auklets especially feed on plankton, but the merlets feed on some fish, some plankton, and some of the larger ones up on top feed on fish. So you can see 8 of those species here in Puget Sound or Salish Sea. And whoever gets me the list of which 8 those are, and that doesn't include Steve Hampton and his birders, who's out there. But if you can name the 8 species that actually do occur here, you get to be a free membership in the World Puffin Congress, which has no admission fees. So puffins, I just set the stage. They have this life cycle. So they're out at sea, and then they come to land to find their mate, and then they lay an egg, and it hatches, and they feed their chicks, and all of this takes place during the summer months, and the chicks fledge, and then they go back out to sea. What this sort of seems like is they're spending an awful lot of time on land, but the truth is they're spending 2/3 of their time at sea. So, their life is not all fun and hobbit holes. And so really it's broken down to their life history is really broken down to what they do and how they function on the three mediums of habitats that we have in this world. There's on land and underneath it when they're burrows, and then there's on the water and under the water where they dive. I should have mentioned all those auks, members of the auk family, all dive to catch their food. They don't just fish at the surface like a lot of seabirds do. They dive underwater. They use their wings to fly, and they can fly to considerable depths and catch fish. So they actually thrive on the water and under the water, and then of course they fly. And I'm going to show you that that's not trivial amount of their time is spent flying, and it's a very energetically costly activity. But they do well in all three mediums, and other than some other seabirds, it's hard to find any animals that actually do well in all three mediums. Can you think of any? It's not a test, but it's other than other seabirds, some of which also live and use all these three mediums. So the seabirds occupy a pretty unique kind of niche in this world, where they do so well in three different mediums. Now, on the land, I just want to review these quickly. So they're occupying the surface here. This is a big colony of tufted puffins in the Aleutian Islands. They occupy the surface layer, and then there's burrows all over the place there. You can't really see. You see some hole entrances, but the whole thing is scattered with as many burrows as there are birds. And they spend about 4 or 5 months of the year coming and going to the colonies every day. And they spend a fair bit of the time of their day, so they're gone, but they also spend a fair bit, especially in early stages when they incubate their eggs. Most puffins nest in burrows underground, and you can see they make very nice hobbit holes. And they make very extensive excavations. You have to have very long arms to work on these birds so that you can actually reach. Sometimes we can't reach them, and you have to dig a little hole and then put your arm in again and then reach some more. Tufted puffins, you may have to do that 2 or 3 times just to get to the actual little nest at the end. So they're very good at digging burrows, and they have lots of adaptations for lots of things, but one of the adaptations they have is these incredible toenails. When you think about it, they use their feet for swimming, but you don't usually see these kind of toenails on swimming ducks. And that's because these nails are used for digging out those holes. And so it's pretty fun when you go to a colony and it's early in the year and they're still excavating or they're clearing out last year's nest, you can actually see dirt just coming up out of the ground here and over here, and as they're just plowing through. And they use their beaks as well for grabbing dirt and mats of grass and pulling it out. So they're very good at that. They also nest in crevices, and they don't always just have to have burrows. If they can find large boulders and find crevices that are protected, the idea is to get away from potential predators. So gulls and falcons and eagles can't steal them or their chicks. So they want to get underground. A good rock will do, a good rock crevice. And they grab some grass to make a little nest. They steal some feathers. That looks like gull feathers. And they light it and then lay their eggs inside. And one of the other activities, when they do this and once the chick is hatched, is they spend a lot of time coming and going to the nest. So part of their routine on land here is once they get there is they've got to find a way to get to their burrow without their food load being stolen by a gull or by another puffin. And so the whole episode of arriving back at the hole and the colony can sometimes be epic. And then there's birds just hanging around doing nothing. So it's just like our society. But these guys, well, they look like they're doing nothing, but they could well be guarding. And so while one of the puffins is out getting food, and it's usually the female, 2/3 of the time, and 2/3 of the time of the male is spent guarding the nest site. That's the usual sort of status. And they hang out outside because, you can have some predators that can make their way down inside. The chick may come out of the burrow and need to be pushed back in, guided back in, and other puffins may come and try and take over the burrow, and that's when you start to see some of these angry puffin battles. So the guarding, when you look at a nest, when you look there in the summertime, you see puffins covering the slopes. They're not just doing nothing. Although some of them probably are just resting. They've just been flying and they need a quick break so they'll catch their breath. But a lot of them are actually standing guard duty, which probably is mostly pretty boring. And then there's other places at the colony where birds gather, sometimes in larger groups, and there's a lot of social stuff going on. God knows what they're saying, but they're communicating and talking to each other and growling and billing. And sometimes these are young birds, teenage and younger, who've only just come back now in their 4th or 5th year, and they don't start to breed until they're 5 or 6. So they come back and they hang out and they just watch and learn. And maybe if they see an empty burrow, they'll go check it out. They start to scope out what it takes to be a puffin and what the burrow scene is like. So when you look at a patch of birds like this at a colony, and it looks like they're doing nothing, but they're actually fulfilling important duties here. And then there's a lot of courtship that goes on at the colonies. A lot of these birds are monogamous. And this is when I say these things about puffins, it's all of the puffins, all have these similar behaviors. And they have long lifetimes, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35 years. And they generally mate with the same bird, and they maintain that relationship for their whole life. There is some divorce, but but they may come back or they lose their mate. And they don't see their mates all winter. They only see them in the summer. So they sort of break up, and then when they come back, they find them. And if they don't find them because they disappeared, they may choose another mate. But they do have very strong bonds. And when they come back in the spring, there's a lot of courtship, and they do a lot of billing where they take the two bills and clack them together, and it actually makes quite a sound. But they do other things. Here they're passing a gift. Sometimes they have fish they'll bring back. It's very, at first when I saw it in the spring, there's no chicks, but sometimes you'll see puffins carrying fish. And that what they're doing is they're bringing a gift to their mate. Here it's an iris flower. So that's on the land. And actually it's not a bad life there. It's not too stressful. If raising a kid and having to beat off predators is not stressful. But in terms of energetic output, it's actually a little bit of a break from all that, working at sea. But when it comes to the air, it's a different story. There's a lot more work being a puffin in the air, and they're actually pretty phenomenal flyers. They can fly about 50 miles an hour. So they're up there with the fastest seabirds in the Northern Hemisphere, even though they kind of people look at them and say, they see them buzzing along in the water, and they say, they don't seem to be very good flyers. But they're actually faster than the gulls and a lot of the other birds you see flying around. And the reason is because they've got these short wings, relatively speaking, and fairly narrow. So they're made so that they can also dive underwater. They reduce the resistance underwater by having smallish wings. If they took that to the limit, they'd be a penguin. They gave up flying, and they have really small little wings, appendages, and they're totally, unfortunately, they can't do anything else but swim. But these birds can still dive and swim underwater quite well, but they also fly. But in order to fly with short, stubby wings, you have to be fast. And that's why jet fighters have short, stubby wings. That's all they need, and they fly fast anyway. They don't need to have big, long wings because their thing is speed. But in order to have the lift to keep you in the air, you have to have the speed. So they're actually very fast. And even though there are people who laugh at puffins, not in my home, that because when you see them out on the water sometimes, and you'll see the same is true for rhinoceros puffins here, if you're crossing on the ferry, you'll see these rafts, and sometimes the boats will flush them up, and you'll see them, and they're trying to get going. Well, you know, the thing is, they don't have a lot of lift with those wings. You've suddenly frightened them off the water. It's a bit choppy. They're trying to get up off the water, which is not easy, and they usually use their feet to start running, literally on the water. That's what he's doing right there. And just enough to get up free of the resistance of the water, and then they can really, you know, do their thing. And so they are good flyers once they've gotten off the water, and they're actually quite beautiful to look at. And here's some rhinoceros puffins. That's taken many of the pictures here and some of the materials from Peter Harrison. You may know Peter. He gave a talk here on albatrosses, but you'll notice that on the cover of his new book that he has puffins, even though he had a big picture of albatrosses. Peter, you're not here, are you? So anyway, he's provided some of these pictures. He's taken a lot of great shots. But this was taken in Port Townsend Bay. So when you really look at it, the aerodynamics of it, the puffin has actually got the same kind. I mean, this is a bird that has to fly fast. And look at the shape of the body and the head, not quite as much, but similar. It's just that big, darn big bill is different. But look, compared to the peregrine, which is the fastest bird known, 180 kilometers an hour. And that's why they designed a B-2 bomber, to be the same shape as a peregrine falcon. And that's why a puffin is, you know, that the form of the puffin is also made for fast flight. So don't be laughing. And so flying is a big deal. They do a lot of it around their colonies. And it takes a lot of work. They're coming and going. Oftentimes, if you go there during the chick rearing time, you'll see this kind of activity at the colony, and almost every other bird will have a fish in its mouth because it's just come back from fishing. Earlier in the season, they're just buzzing around. Maybe there's one of the birds is incubating an egg down on the ground. The other one's, you know, coming back at the end of the day, and they build up in these clouds. Really spectacular. And you can just have them just circling around and around and rush of wind as they all come flying by you. It's quite a deal. But it takes a lot of energy to do that. So Jasper, my grandson, is going to come up here and show you just what it takes. Right? No. Stephanie? No? Okay. Well, I just challenge you to think about what it takes to be a puffin. When they fly, they fly that takes 400 beats per minute. 400. So I was teasing because Jasper, I went to his class and made him in class, all the kids get up and stand up and do, because their wings go all the way up and they come all the way down. And I got the kids and challenged them to how many wing beats can you do, you know, in a minute? Can you do 400? And and so we only did 15 seconds to see what that would, because that would be 100. But nobody even came close to that, because it's a heck of a lot of work. And that's the reason why a lot of these puffins have such, you see them, they got this big breast and this big, this torso is really huge and sticks out. They look like they're proud puffins as they walk around. Oh, here we go, right here. This thrown out chest, and that's all muscle. Half the muscle in this bird is right there. It's what keeps those wings going, and it's those wings that keep it going, and it's very energetically costly. It can make the metabolic rate double or triple to keep going and do flying. So it takes a lot of energy to do that. And so when you add it up, if there's 400 beats a minute, Then in the course of a 2 or 3 hour foraging trip, one foraging trip to go out, 20, 30, 40 miles and find a patch of food and then feed, fly around, feed, and then come back, then you're going to have to beat your wings 50 to 75,000 times. But that's just one trip. Each adult's going to bring 2 or 3 meals to the chick every single day. So that's going to be 100 to 225,000 wing beats in that day. And then they've got to do that for 40 to 60 days in a row. So in the course of just rearing their kids, they have to beat the wings 4 to 13 million times, which is pretty amazing. And it's just, you can picture that that takes a lot of energy. And so the other thing that takes a lot of energy, and here's another bit of info from Peter Harrison. This is from his book, The Seabirds, Seabirds of the World, he recently published. And this just shows on the left-hand side, there's the largest picture of birds is the summertime breeding plumage. The rest are other plumages. But here, most focus on the maps. What you see is that these birds range over an enormous area of the Atlantic and Pacific. And all the lines along the coasts, the yellow or green, which is both wintering and breeding sort of habitat, they're close to the colonies, and they may forage up to 100 kilometers away. So there's sort of a band there of sort of habitat that they occupy. But in the wintertime, they migrate thousands of kilometers away. Up here, birds that are breeding up in Svalbard and up in northern Norway may actually fly all the way down past Iceland and all the way down to the coast of Newfoundland and overwinter down here. And birds that are breeding up here in the Arctic may come all the way down here and fly down towards this is the transition zone between subarctic and subtropical waters here. There's Hawaii, halfway to Hawaii. So these are long, that's not a long migration for an albatross or some of the shearwaters that live in the Southern Hemisphere that come for this. But they've got these huge wings. And they can fly, they can sail. The albatross, you can watch an albatross coming on a ship and watch it come from a mile away and watch it leave and never see it flap its wings because it's just sailing. There's energy, don't get me wrong, there's energy required for that. But for these birds then, all of this activity of getting out to these wintering grounds and then foraging underwater in winter, there's no pictures of this, because there's no idiots that would be stupid enough to be out there in the North Atlantic and North Pacific. Well, I did that once, and it was really dumb. It's really terrible waves and rough seas and spray and, and illness. And they do it all the time. In fact, when these birds leave as chicks from these islands, all these islands in here where chicks are produced, they also go out there. For the very first time, they leave the colony. They've never flown, they've never swum, they've never dove. And then they go out to the North Central Pacific, and they stay there for several years. And then they come back and start exploring the idea of going to a colony. Extraordinary birds, extraordinary living in extreme circumstances. And then when you think about what happens on the water, it's even hard to believe, but it's much more impressive. So they can swim very well, and they can swim underneath very well. And they get all the food they need for both the adults and chicks. And they do it by flying underwater. So they sort of half fold their wings and they flap. And they're very good at it. And if you've been to, who's been to an aquarium? Let's see hands for that. An aquarium where puffins fly. Okay, so you've seen them fly in those tanks. Then they just turn on a dime, and they can just go down, and then they turn around to come up, and they just kind of bubble their way up. They don't hardly have to work because the buoyancy takes them up, and then they turn around and they dive right back down again. Well, they're diving proud. Their speed, they can do this at 2.5 meters per second. Just let that sink in for a second. Underwater travel at 2.5 meters per 1 second. So, and sustain that to dive to extraordinary depths. So, to put it in context, here's the tower, the Space Needle, and that's about 600 feet. And the biggest member of the family is now, after the extinct great auk, is the murre. And it can dive to 600 feet, which is pretty extraordinary and kind of mind-boggling, as it's 280 pounds per square inch pressure down there. And it's pretty much blackness from 200 meters down. So how they pursue food, find food down there, and how they survive that pressure is pretty amazing. Well, puffins, tufted puffins especially, can dive over 400 meters, and rhinos and horns can dive more than 200 meters. And so all of them get into 100 to 200 pounds per square inch pressure and darkness. So, this is incredible. And these are the maximums. So most of their dives are shallower, 40 and 60. And I mean, they're not stupid. If the fish are shallow, that's what they're going for. But at times of year when the prey go deeper and things like that, they may well have to consistently go to much greater depths, and they can go to these maximums. But when they go and do these foraging trips, they don't just go and dive once or twice. They may dive 50, 100, 150, 200 times. Some of them short, smaller dives, looking, trying to find things. Maybe they finally find something and they feed. So these foraging trips are not holidays. So they're very successful at what they do. And you've seen these kind of pictures before, and all the puffins have the same behavior, and they have the same modification of their bills that allow them to catch and hold more than one fish at a time. And one of the adaptations they have for that is that the bill of their mouth, you see this base here, all of them have this sort of spongy little bit of flesh here at the base of the bill. And what's happening is this is kind of a springy, spongy material that allows the base of the bill to actually open up. So instead of having a beak that looks like this, that's a V, for which if you were trying to catch fish, you could catch a fish here, but that's it. You can't close your beak anymore. So you really can't stack a bunch of fish in here. So there's lots of seabirds that can catch fish, and you see them coming back, and they got one fish in their mouth. But puffins, because the beak can unhinge, it's kind of like a vice, right? That when you open it up, and the whole thing opens up. So the whole bill opens up from the bottom, where it's right at the base of the bill, all the way to the end. So this is more like a vice. The whole thing closes and opens and closes and opens. And so they can put in one bird, they can use their tongue to get another one and 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 another one, up to like 60 or 70 birds. Those are small fish. They do other things at sea. They wash themselves, they take baths. The colony is kind of a mucky place to live. But they also have to take care of their feathers. They do a lot of preening to keep the oils, keep themselves waterproof. They are, one of the reasons I think people love these birds is because they're way into courtship. So at sea, they have a lot of courtship as well as on land. The same sort of thing. There's a lot of affectionate billing, and you'll see that on the water as well as on land. And around here, you can have the unusual sighting of two different species. This was Smith Island last summer. And there was, I don't know, anybody know the Salish Sea School out of Anacortes? And they have a whole program, kids teaching about the ocean and marine things. Anyway, they've been monitoring the puffins there for years. So this horned puffin here has been coming. There's about 20 or 30 tufted puffins that breed on Smith Island still. And there's no tufted puffins, or no horned puffins that I know of breeding south of northern British Columbia and up into Alaska. They don't come down here, except for this one. This one bird's been showing up every year at Smith Island for the last, I think, 6 years, 7 years, all by itself. and it never finds a mate because there's just the one. And so but this is how immigration works, and this is how this is how new colonies get formed. Is adventurous puffins go off, and then they wait for somebody else to come, and then you go, and then you got a colony starting. But in this case, this one's been waiting for years, and it's finally decided to take matter into its own hands. Here's some courtship behavior on the water. These are rhinoceros puffins. This bowing. This is the ritual bowing to each other. So, and other activities, important activities. These are birds that are gathered up at the colony, at a colony, and they're not far from the colony here. They're just gathering up. Probably they've been out foraging. They're coming back. They're resting here on the water, and they're socializing. And so, but then to distinguish it, there's also a lot of aggregation like that at sea when birds are foraging. So these are rhinoceros puffins, and this is Port Townsend Bay, taken from the ferry. I took this picture. That's Indian Island, or Marystone. I don't know. It's one of those. And this is, I think it is. Where is it? Anyway, this is Port Townsend Bay, and these are foraging birds. They've been foraging on sand lance, which is why they're out there in large numbers, and that's what supports the island, Protection Island. One of the main things that they rely on is the food supply here in Port Townsend Bay. It's a treasure trove of sand lance, and that's why all the salmon also love to come to Port Townsend Bay, and they feed on the shelf. When you look out there in the summer and see all those fishing boats lined up on Port Townsend Bay, they're lined up on the shelf edge. There are usually flocks of these birds around at the same time, after the same food, which is sand lance. But it's no trouble to see this kind of flocking there in spring and summer. Well, okay, that was the fun stuff. Now it's the unfun stuff. Well, maybe not so fun, but somewhat interesting. I got hired years ago to every time I got hired for doing seabird stuff, it was to find out why they were dying, whether it was dying in nets or dying and washing up on beaches, wrecks, or starvation, or because of oil pollution, or they were eating too much plastics, or too many ships were disturbing them. So there's a lot of things that influence, factors that influence seabirds. And there's a long list of them. But there's also a lot of natural sort of things going on that also affect populations in the birds. And so those two can get confusing as to what is more important. So oftentimes, and a manager would come to me and say, well, okay, so what's the deal? Is this a problem or not? And it's always like, well, we don't have enough data because we don't really know, what the birds were doing before this oil spill happened. And so, did the oil spill really kill all these birds and take away 40% of the population in the case of the Exxon Valdez spill? Or was there some natural cycle in the environment that was going on that just happened to change from being colder than average to being warmer than average right about the time of before the oil spill, that changed the ecology of the entire region and the food supply for all the birds? That might have had some effect on the populations. And by gosh, it turns out that it probably did. It affected plankton, fish, birds, whales, fishing, fish populations, everything. So it gets complicated. And I'm not going to, another talk I could tell you about, I've studied most of those kind of effects. But the one that's in most recent years that has been most alarming to me is ocean warming and its impact on food webs, because it seems to be becoming more and more common a problem. And so, to look at that, and you can look at that for a lot of different seabirds, but part of the problem is you don't really know all the time what the seabirds are eating. But fortunately with puffins, you see how they carry all those fish. Well, they're easy to use. You can actually study them and their food supply by stealing their food and finding out what they eat. which you can't do with all the other birds because you have to pretty much shoot them if you want to see what they're eating. And, that's not very helpful. With puffins, you can actually get the data from the birds themselves. They go out and they go in all these directions, all around the column, and they sample the water column, and they find out what kind of fish is around. So we've been able to track what's happening with food supply, and people, and I say we, I mean hundreds of people measuring all kinds of data on many colonies in Alaska and California, Washington, Oregon. You put together a picture of what's going on with food webs and how it's changing over time. And part of the issue is also that you've got different predators out there. You've got whales, but a lot of these predators I'm picturing eat a lot of the same prey. So whatever we find out about puffins and their diets is relevant to whales and to seals and to codfish and to salmon and to other species that eat the same kind of prey. So we can use the puffin to help guide us as to what's going on with food. And so one of the things we learn about puffins early on and continue to identify is that they have a preference, and so do most of these other predators, and who can blame them. They prefer to eat fat, oily fish. So they like anchovies down in California, and they like sand lance pretty much everywhere, and herring, where their pockets of herring are abundant. They like oily fish that are relatively small. These aren't they're not fish that are grown. They will take juveniles of big fish like this. Like they'll take juvenile pollock that are only this big in their first year of life. But that's kind of a lean cuisine. It's white meat, doesn't have a lot of fat. So it can have 2/3 the amount of energy or half the energy as a nice fat sand lance. So these are the kinds of prey that they like, and they maximize their energy intake. And as I labored to tell you, all of the activities that these puffins do so well at that allow them to survive in these extreme environments and to be able to dive to those depths and fly to those areas, the energy that it takes to do that comes at a cost. It requires a huge amount of energy. And so you're going to go for the best food you can get. And so that's part A of understanding what puffins are doing, and some of the other seabirds. The same applies to murres, the same story. They really go for the fat, oily fish when they can, and the same applies to humpback whales. They go for the fat, oily stuff when they can. The other part of the story is but what, how much do they need? And this one is, in this graphic, there's a lot to unpack, but I'm going to focus on this, which is that while these animals are all bigger than a puffin, especially this humpback whale, it's 30,000 kilograms, and they do eat more overall in a day, but compared to their body mass, they only need about 1% to 2% of their body mass. So they only need to acquire that much. And what that allows the whale to do, because it puts on so much fat, is it allows it to stock up, feed for 6 months or more of the year in the rich waters of the continental coast and up in Alaska, and then go to Hawaii and not feed at all for months and bear young, and then they come back and they pig out and feed themselves. So they've got an ability to last a long time without food supply. And humans can last for weeks without food. These fish have even more remarkable. They're cold-blooded. So they really have it's almost an order of magnitude, 10-fold difference between us and cold-blooded animals. They need far less food because they're not fueling a fire. Well, these are all warm-blooded animals, and they're all trying to maintain a pretty high body temperature, which allows their bodies to be very efficient, and all the enzymes and proteins and everything's working at 98.6. And if it gets too high, the body regulates it. If it gets a little low, the body tries to regulate it. In a cold-blooded animal, you are what you live in. Your metabolism is a function of the surrounding temperature. And cold-blooded fish really just don't need that much. So this fish, even though it weighs 4 times as much as this puffin, it only needs a 1/20th of the amount of food per day. And it only needs, less than 1% of its body mass every day. Okay, in the extreme, and the reason the puffin is so big is because it requires 50% of its body mass. Because it has such high energetic needs, it has to eat 50% of its body mass. So it has to eat, a half a kilogram of food every single day. Well, that's extraordinary. And you got to think about that. If this guy here is 80 kilograms, about 180 pounds, you can do the math and figure out how much he would have to eat if he was a puffin. And he had to eat half 180 pounds every day, 90 pounds of food every day. Then he would have to eat a McDonald's Big Mac and fries every 15 minutes of a 16-hour day. All it would be doing would be eating and pooping. And that's pretty much what a puffin is. It's a voracious predator and poop machine. As you'll know if you ever go to a colony, because you'll get pooped on. It's just what happens, and the gulls and everybody else. So, and the reason is because all these seabirds, they need so much more food than we do. Well, this is a big deal, and it means that they're more vulnerable. Of all these predators, when food gets scarce, it's going to be seabirds that have the problem. And so here's an example, the Pacific heat wave of 2014-16. How many people are familiar with that? Yeah, well, not as many as I would have thought, but it was a major event of 2014-16, and it really threw a wrench into the ocean, and it heated an enormous area of water from south of Baja all the way up to the Gulf of Alaska, and even into the Bering Sea for some period. So it was this enormous anomaly. It was several degrees warmer than average for 2 years. So it was a sustained sort of a thing. And one of the consequences was we lost 4 million common murres, which is half the population in the Gulf of Alaska and Bering Sea. So here's the most abundant fish-feeding seabird in Alaska, most successful, the common murre, the neighbor of the cousin of the puffin, most successful seabird, and half of them disappeared during the heat wave, and most of it occurred during the winter of 2015, early 2016, 2015, 2016. Extraordinary, no, we'd never seen anything like that. I mean, I've seen die-offs of seabirds before, like tens, hundreds, thousands die off for the same problem. These birds don't have a lot of reserve. If they don't get food for 2 or 3 or 4 days, they're dead. So if there's a real problem, food shortage, and there can be other reasons besides heat waves to have a shortage of food, if they don't get it for a few days, whereas, those whales, well, they can live for a long time without food. And humans, much longer too. And so this heat wave not only took out all those murres, but it also took out tens or 100,000 or so of Cassin's auklets. It took out thousands or even 10,000 of tufted puffin and rhinoceros puffins in Oregon, Washington, California. It knocked the Pacific cod population down by 75% in 1 year. They had to close the fishery. And we have an expert on that right here who could tell you more if you want to know about that. And it was a shock to everybody in Alaska. But they didn't really understand what had happened for a few years after birds washed up on beaches. Because the birds die right away. And the cod thing took a little while to play out. And the same is true for humpbacks. Humpbacks in the North Pacific, the numbers that used to come back to Glacier Bay every year for 30 years before this event was a steady increase. The whales were increasing from the 70s when the whaling had occurred in the 60s, and the numbers went up and up and up and up every year. It was a little bit of a staircase, but it just kept going up. And then 2014, 15, and they tanked 50% of what they'd been seeing there. And then very slowly after that, it's been starting to come back. Throughout all of the North Pacific, they did studies subsequent after some years of gathering data and determined that the entire North Pacific population probably declined by, I think it was 20%, maybe 25, something like that, which is an enormous decline for an animal that took 30 years to struggle back to its populations. So these were all very large sort of events. And so cut to the point, all the evidence points to widespread starvation was the main cause for all these different animals. For the cod, there were skinny cod. Nobody'd seen so much skinny cod. The whales were skinny. People were talking about all these skinny whales. Have you ever even heard of skinny whales? They could really see, and you could see it, I saw it, you could see humpbacks when you could see their collarbones and stuff. Their stick protruding out. I'd never seen that before. And nor had people working on them for 20 years. So starvation looked like to be the cause, and then the question is, well, this is something that played out from California, Oregon, Washington, British Columbia, the Gulf of Alaska, and into the Bering Sea. This is 2 or 3 separate marine ecosystems, separate and connected, but different unique systems. And we lost all of this wildlife in a relatively short period of time. And in my view, one of the sort of the most likely or parsimonious theory is something got rid of all of the fish in all of these regions at the same time. All the forage fish, the fat, oily fish that everybody needs. Reduce the population synchronously. Lots of times there's fish go through cycles, and sometimes one fish will be doing poorly, but another fish is doing just fine. And you can get through that. It's like having a stock portfolio where one stock bums out, but if you've got a few other stocks that are doing well, you're okay. But in this case, it's actually called a portfolio effect. When all of the stocks of prey disappear, you're basically in deep doo-doo. There's no alternative prey that's going to get you through. And so this is likely to be the explanation. And the mechanisms by which that happened that could have knocked out all these forage fish at the same time, I believe are related to the fact that all these fish are cold-blooded. And when the temperatures got really warm, it decreased the efficiency at which they could exist, where they could live, at the depths and the places that they could live, and it revved up their metabolisms. They had to eat more, but then food started to get scarce for them, and it gets cut for them, and then it got scarce for the ones that were eating them, and it got scarce for the ones that ate them, and then it got scarce for humans. So it all played out over a couple of years, but basically it led to one of the most disastrous ecological events of, I don't know, my 40 years, 50 years, I guess now, of doing research on seabirds. So anyway, puffins, you see? Now look how quiet everybody is. Sorry, this is the depressing part. But important to recognize, but the point is also that puffins actually helped us to understand this. And so people sometimes say, what do you do? You study puffins, and so who cares? Nothing personal, but why would we want to know anything about them? Well, we have to take care of them. It's a responsibility it's a trust species of the Department of Interior. It's part of their migratory birds, and we're responsible for their welfare. So that should be enough explanation. But they also tell us a lot about what's going on out there, because they're visible. We saw the birds die. We saw them wash ashore, and they're super abundant in their colonies. So you can go to their colonies and collect data. It's not like doing fish work, and you got to get a ship, and you got to spend millions of dollars to send people out there, and then you got to put a net in the water and try and catch the damn things. And then it's really a lot more efficient in some ways to go to a puffin colony, just sit there and wait for them to bring all the food to you and steal it from them. Little bits, just little bits. But there's so many of them, you just need a little bit, and you can get a good idea what's going on. They depend entirely on the ocean food for their livelihood and safe habitat. So if the birds are doing poorly, you're going to know. They can be used to monitor the pelagic food, is what I've been saying, because you can get the food from them, and there's colonies everywhere. So anywhere you want to get information, you can get information. They're not the only ones that give us good information. I'm just saying they're pretty good at what they do. But also the key thing is, I think, is that they also have this fast metabolism, and they have this Achilles heel. You know, their vulnerability is that they have to have 50% of their biomass in food every day, no matter what the weather's like. So it's not like, I don't think I'm going to go to the store today, honey. You know, it's you got to go. You got to go every day, no matter what the weather is, and in winter. So they're vulnerable, and so they're really the sort of the classic canaries in the coal mine. We keep an eye on them in the future, and we can see what's happening. Well, so the future of oceans, the future of puffins, we've looked at this a lot, and we looked at the effects of heat waves on birds of all kinds over the years, and if this is sort of a synthesis of decades of work by a bunch of different people about what are the effects. But I'm not going to dwell on the details here, but just to say that that puffins and murres and some other species were hard hit. Other species are better adapted for that kind of food deprivation. They may feed on other things. They have other strategies. It's a complicated system out there. Not everything succumbs when we have a heat wave. But it is serious, and it could get worse if it lasts longer or if it's stronger, and more species may become involved. But there's good news and bad about these heat waves. And part of the bad news is that we know what's going to happen in the future. I am not plotting any projected graphics here, because we've all seen those, and people are skeptical, I think, about some of those models. But I will say that back in the early 70s, scientists projected with the current changes in atmospheric carbon dioxide, how much the temperature change would be and what it would look like, and it's pretty much the same as this line here. So I think there's a little bit of vindication there about what predictions will do. But what's going to happen from here on? This is the most recent, so that's where we're at. But for oceans, it's even a little more. I'm not sure whether people fully appreciate. But the impact is even greater in the ocean. So this is the heat content. This is how much heat's been absorbed, not just the temperature for the day or the temperature for the week or the month. So it's been a warm air temperature, and that's what that last graph was. That was surface air temperature. But the atmosphere see this bottom line, this little slightly dark red one. That's atmosphere. That's how much heat it's absorbed. There's earth, there's ice, that's how much is melted. This is ocean. It absorbs most of the heat. And so it's going up. And we're going to see more, unless we can do some things to make that start to level off, or something else changes, that is probably going to cause more damage. And so, just the last little bit to say, we have, after I retired, I thought, well, because I work with the data and I see the studies that other scientists are producing about how things that are happening in the sea are affecting birds, puffins in particular. I thought, well, we don't do a very good job sometimes. A lot of scientists in getting the information out to everybody, to the public that may not be specialists in seabird ecology. We go to meetings and we share our stuff with other scientists, and that's important. But I think a lot of the information takes a long time to trickle out. So we decided to create an organization called the World Puffin Congress, and I've got a bunch of puffin scientists from around the world who. One of the things about working on seabirds and puffins is if you want to understand what's happening to them, you have to understand something about the oceanography and about the schools of fish and about what's happening and what's happening with overfishing and contaminants and oil pollution. You have to know something about all of it. So I've got a bunch of scientists involved who are interested in being part of this organization, and as they publish their papers, we're going to take them and try and summarize them, and we're going to, produce some information about the biology of the birds and get that out. These are just some pages of the work that we've sort of completed. And so we'll have these scientists were involved in a paper that looked at puffins and the effects of a marine heat wave off the Gulf of Maine and how the adults responded to feeding the chicks. And it's just a straightforward paper, and there's a summary which goes on and on down here below, but summarizes in a fairly straightforward way what the findings of the study were, which were positive and interesting about how the birds were able to cope with this heat wave that they had. So we're gonna put this kind of information on the website and make it available to people. We're gonna have other people involved, people who actually work on puffins in the field, people who are wardens and park rangers, and people who take people out to go to see puffins, the people who drive the boats, and who take people out on land in Europe, and they know a lot about what's going on with these populations. We're going to try and get all of them to come to our party, and we're going to celebrate puffins. We're going to have artists and writers, and we're all going to get together online and share all this information. So I'm hoping we'll be up and running in a couple of months.
We went on a trip to Svalbard, and they mentioned that the currents have changed because of warming, and so the fish migration, which is based on ocean temperature, I guess, no longer syncs up with the nesting cycle of the puffins, the Atlantic puffins, because they're tuned into daylight. So one is ocean temperature and current, and the other one's daylight, and they don't match. Mm-hmm. And so the pufflings are dying, starving.
Yeah, well, I think that's in the Atlantic in particular. That's the same. They're seeing the same thing around Iceland. The currents are changing. There's more that cold Arctic water, less of it, and more Atlantic water, and so the composition of the community of plankton and the fish is changing with that. And so and so I think in Iceland they've lost a huge number of birds in the last 20 years because of that. And just to balance that, there are other places like in Newfoundland where populations of puffins have been increasing dramatically for the last 30 years, and nobody really knows why, but it's great. The colony that I used to work at, 40 years ago, is now at least tripled what it used to be. I mean, it's phenomenal. And it's probably related to changing currents over time. There, they get cold water from Labrador, and the Gulf Stream comes up and meets it there. And I don't know, anyway, so the currents and the long-term changes really can make a big difference. In the Pacific, it's different. A lot of the water that's flowing up from crossing the Pacific, it goes north into Alaska. It all exits and goes into the Arctic. So it is happening in the sense that up in the Arctic, it's warming dramatically, and the ice is melting, and the fish populations are absolutely changing up there. They're getting fish up in northern Bering Sea and into the Arctic Ocean that they just never had. I mean, they occurred periodically, but now they're just like moving en masse into those regions, and they're replacing some of the stuff that was there. So no, it's happening.
I know there's been some coverage of ocean heat waves around the world, in the mainstream press. But could you speak a little bit more about that? I mean, we're very familiar with what happened in the Pacific, and know that it can happen again so easily. But what about other parts of the world?
Well, I think of Europe. They've had some pretty severe heat waves in the last 15 years. 2013, and I think 2021 or 22. The same sort of thing, a massive amount of warming over a large body of water that persists for a fairly long time. That's a real remedy. That's a real recipe for disaster. Because getting warm for a little while, a lot of the fish can tolerate that. They don't care too much if their metabolic rate goes up for a while. If it cools off again, and they can return to their normal sort of balance. But when it lasts for weeks and months and years, then it's a much more. Then it allows whole communities to change. If it lasts through the winter, it's particularly bad. Through the fall and winter, because that's when a lot of survival aspects of life play out. And so organisms may, if they're not doing well, and then they have to go into a winter and they're underfed, et cetera, et cetera. And that's what happened in Europe. And they had some major heat waves that, they took a hit on some of their stocks of fish. And the puffins and seabirds took a big hit there. And then they had the virus, the avian flu showed up, and that wiped out even more birds. And those things go sometimes hand in hand. When birds are vulnerable because of one reason, and then you bring in disease, they're more vulnerable, even more vulnerable because of that.
Are the puffins and other auks subject to the virus? Are they vulnerable to the virus?
I'm sorry.
The bird virus.
What about it? Sorry.
So are puffins vulnerable to?
Oh yes.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. They have had not too bad, but they've had some places where they took a hit, but they never seem to be. There have been some species that were a whole, 90% of birds who were wiped out, at a particular colony in Europe, and they took some hits on the east coast of Canada as well, with that. But it's funny which birds it picks, and so we were concerned for some time when this started happening. They were having massive die-offs in Europe, and the virus was being picked up on the west coast of the U.S. and making its way up. It was being observed in a variety of species all the way up to Alaska, and came to Alaska. And the birds that we have, lots of the same birds in Alaska that they have in Europe, the murres and the puffins, same species, and kittiwakes, same species, fulmars, and a variety of species that identical, and nothing happened. And we thought, oh man, this thing is really virulent. It's really taken out a lot of these puffins and murres and gannets in Europe. And yet, then we waited, and nothing happened. So it's the people who work on the virus at the center I was working at. I asked about this, and they're like, "Yeah, well, we don't really know, but we do think that sometimes it does maybe has to do with how vulnerable they are. If they've got lots of food, if the conditions are normal or in a normal range, and they're able to get what they need." Their bodies are in good shape. They don't have high stress levels. Maybe they just can fight it off. So there's still a lot to learn there.
I just was wondering, it was like a crisis in 2016 and 15 and 14 with the big heat wave, but every year we hear that it's the hottest year from the previous one. How did it even out? It's not keeping and going up, is it? That's what I'm confused about.
I took that slide out, sorry.
What?
But I wish I had the slide to show you. The thing is, it's important to distinguish between climate change and global warming. And people get confused, and I get confused, about when people start talking about climate change, and sometimes people say, well, they're talking about global warming, and really they're talking about climate change. Global warming is just one piece of climate change. So what there are also are cycles. There's cycles of warm and cold. El Nino is a classic example, but they only happen every 1 to 4 to 7 years on average, and sometimes you get a couple in a row, but they're kind of a cycle, and then they get a La Nina afterwards, and things get cooler. So it's a cycle that corrects itself. And it goes on, and it's every few years, every 4 to 7 years, and it's been doing that forever. It's a cycle, and it's based, and that cycle is coming from deep oceanographic and atmospheric historical phenomenon that I frankly don't understand. You know, the details of, especially the atmospheric, you know, low pressure systems that live here for, you know, even 2 decades, and suddenly they move and they decide they're going to hang out over here in Southeast Alaska instead of being out in the Aleutians. And then that changes the currents, and it changes, and it lasts for 20 years, and then it goes back. You know, it's a cycle, and it's called a decadal cycle. And those exist in the Pacific, and they exist in the Arctic, and in the Atlantic, and down in the South Atlantic, and in polar regions. So that, you know, these 10-year and 20-year and 30-year cycles exist, and they're not hugely predictable, but they definitely have a pattern. But they always return to a colder. You know, they go warmer and then they go to colder, and they balance out. And then you can see a transition sometimes where for 20 years, and you have a community that likes to be at 7 or 8 degrees centigrade on average, and they revolve around that kind of range, and then the temperatures cool, and everything gets, you know, the average temperature becomes 5 or 6, and then the community changes over time. It takes years, but it will replace all these species that like that bit warmer water. Now get replaced by fish that like a little bit, that perform better at lower temperatures, and they, you know, they don't disappear altogether, but some of them get scarcer and others become more abundant. So it's like, well, you might have 20 species that did well here, and then they just decline, and you have other 20 species that were pretty rare that become abundant. But with global warming, the temperature is doing this. I make a straight line, but it's not a straight line. It's more like this, and sometimes it just stops for a few years, and a volcano blows, and it puts all this stuff in the atmosphere, and it cools off the Earth, but then it just picks up. I mean, it's just been going up and up and up, and that's against the background of all these annual, biannual, decadal oscillations that now are oscillating, but the background temperature is now coming up, and so they're oscillating, and what was high for them in 30 or 40 or 50 years is now going to be low for them, because the background temperatures are going to go beyond that. And what's going to happen is anybody's guess, because nobody really knows what happens when the baseline temperature is going to be higher than what an El Nino used to be. Maybe El Ninos will just stop and will be replaced by something else. But it's really tricky, and it's really hard to say any kind of certainty. But it is a very different thing. And so when we talk about climate change, we're including all of those. Climate change is about the annual, the El Ninos, and about the decadal cycles, and about other cycles, and about global warming, which is one. But the one, all of them, that's consistently just going up and up and up and up. And we don't have a good answer for what's going to happen, and when it's going to happen, because we haven't lived in this kind of extreme temperature change ever.
How faithful are they to their burrow site? Do they come back to the exact same burrow? Is that how they find their mate again?
Probably, partly. I think they can find them out in the water, but yes, they come back to the same burrows. You know, they've invested a lot of time and energy in those burrows, so they come back, and they actually come back pretty early, and they found that these colonies, not just in puffins, but also for birds that nest on ledges. You know, nest site habitat is prime territory, and if you've been a successful bird, you've learned all the tricks, you know, and this particular nest works for you, and you've been very productive there. The odds are that you're going to come back and do that again. But those birds that are successful usually come back early than a lot of other birds, because they know that they got a prime site and they want to protect it. So they show up early, long before the egg gets laid. They come back and they'll start hanging out and guarding their site and protecting it. They may be another month before they ever lay an egg.
So the site is pretty stable. They don't have to re-dig that site.
Well, sometimes, I mean, there can be a rain or snow or things in the winter that may have collapsed a burrow or collapsed some habitat or whatever. But a lot of them are just, you know, they're those burrows are pretty. In some colonies, many colonies, the ground is, you know, it's a turf. It's like a peat. You know, if you've ever dug in peat, you know, it's got all the roots from previous plants in it. It's all packed hard. And it's you know, they can claw that out. And it is pretty strong. You can walk on those burrows and not fall through in a lot of places. You can walk on in some places where it's really dry and not very thick layer, you can fall through with your weight. But mostly, a lot of plases, you know, you can just walk over there. I mean, those are tunnels that are meant to last. And they'll be there next year.
Thanks so much for all your work.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
What advice do you have for agency staff responsible for managing puffin colonies?
Not fire all your employees.
Agreed.
No kidding, which is what happened recently, in Alaska at least. And, we have somebody here who can speak to NOAA and nymphs about what they did there. But seriously, we lost a lot of high-quality people. And so what we can do is rebuild and get people back on that. I think there was a lot of people, and there still is a lot of people working on marine birds, but seabirds in particular are kind of in a weird niche. They're the Department of the Interior, but they live on the exterior. They live out on the ocean. And so their mandate for the interior is to take care of animals, birds and fish that live in land. But when it comes to the ocean, they kind of scratch their heads sometimes and say, why are we doing this? But you know, they are protected by the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. So we have to take care of them. It's the responsibility of the management agency as the Fish and Wildlife Service. NOAA, NIMS gets drawn into it. They have to deal with it because birds get caught in nets and fishing gear. And they have other interests. And they often, I mean, their fisheries that they manage, some of them in some places, have an impact on the food supply for birds. So they have to do ecosystem management, and they do it quite well in Alaska and Washington, I think. But Department of Interior is not quite as integrated, I think, as NIMS is with all, you know, and that's something that they could certainly improve. But I think it's, having a program, period, would be useful.